The rain had not stopped in 4 days, and on the 5th night the river came into Pellenby without knocking. Philippa Tallow heard it before she saw it, a groan under the dispensary floorboards, the particular wet wood smell that meant water was already inside the walls. She was out of bed and lacing her boots before she was fully awake, because 9 years beside her father's surgery had taught her that floodwater did not wait for anyone to finish dressing. By the time she reached the green, half the village was already there. Someone had dragged the sandbag stores out from the vestry lean-to and stacked them in rows along the edge of the green. 40 sacks, maybe 50, nowhere near enough. Philippa picked one up without breaking stride, so unaccountably had a stranger she did not recognize. She did not know what he was yet. What she saw was a carriage sunk to its axles at the ford, a coachman swearing at the horses, and a tall man in a ruined coat standing beside the sandbag stacks with the particular stillness of someone who had never once in his life been the most useless person in a crowd, and did not know what to do about it, now that he was. "You cannot possibly expect his grace to carry sacks," said the smaller man beside him, wringing his hands as though they were laundry. "I don't expect anything from his grace," Philippa said, not slowing. "I expect it from anyone with 2 working arms. Which is he?" The tall man raised his hand mildly, the way a boy might own up to breaking a window. "That would be me." "Good." She thrust a sandbag into his chest. He caught it more by instinct than skill. "Fill it, tie it, stack it against the dispensary wall. The medicines are in there. If the water gets in, half this village goes without a doctor by morning." "I've never filled a sandbag." "You've never done a great many things, I should think. Today you'll do one more." He looked at her for a moment, not affronted, which surprised her, and not amused either, which surprised her more. Then he took off his coat, folded it with more care than the situation warranted, and handed it to the small man. "Sims, try not to drown it." "Your Grace." "Hold the coat, Sims." Philippa was already moving on. She had 11 more sandbags to place, and a dispensary door built 4 inches too low for the century they were living in, and she did not have time to watch whether a duke could tie a knot. He could not, as it happened. It took him 3 attempts and a torn cuff before Tom Tallow, 11 years old and delighted beyond all reason, showed him how. "You do it like this," Tom said. "Over, under, pull." He demonstrated with the patience of a boy who had never before been permitted to instruct anyone above the rank of dog. "You're doing it wrong on purpose, aren't you?" "I promise you I am not. Nobody's this bad at knots by accident." "I have never," Callum said with some dignity, "had occasion to learn." Tom considered this. "What do you do, then?" "At present, apparently, sandbags." The widow Cray came past with a lantern, saw the stranger kneeling in mud tying knots under the instruction of an 11-year-old, and stopped dead. "That's never the man from the carriage. The one they said was—" "He's the one filling sandbags, Mrs. Cray," Philippa called without turning. "That's all any of us need to know about him tonight." "But surely someone ought to—" "Someone ought to fetch dry blankets for the Pell house before their roof goes. That's you, if you've a moment." Mrs. Cray went, muttering, and did not raise the subject again that night, though it was clear from the set of her shoulders that she intended to raise it extensively with someone else the moment daylight came. By midnight there was a second crisis. Old Mr. Fenwick, hauling his own furniture out of his flooding cottage, had gone down hard on a broken chair leg and opened a gash along his forearm that would not stop its slow, insistent bleeding. Philippa's father was 3 streets over with the Pells. There was no one else. "You," she said to Callum, who was still stacking sandbags a few yards off. "Come here now." He came without a word of complaint about the tone. "Hold the lantern there, steady, don't let it swing higher." She was already kneeling by Fenwick, pressing linen to the wound with the flat, unhesitating pressure of long habit. "Talk to him. Keep him from looking at it." "Talk to him about what?" "I don't care, horses, the weather, anything that isn't his arm." Callum crouched on Fenwick's other side. Lantern held rock steady despite everything else about the night being chaos, and began with visible effort to discuss the merits of Suffolk punch horses over Clydesdales, a subject about which, it emerged over the next several minutes, he knew a very great deal and Fenwick knew almost nothing, which suited the purpose admirably, since it left Fenwick nothing to do but disagree loudly and forget, for whole stretches at a time, that his arm was being sewn shut by lantern light in the rain. "There," Philippa said at last, tying off the final stitch. "You'll do. Keep it dry, keep it clean, and come to the surgery Thursday, so I can look at it properly." Fenwick, pale but steadying, looked between the two of them. "Didn't know dukes held lanterns." "This one does," Callum said, "when he's told to." Philippa glanced at him, a brief, assessing look, the kind she gave a new instrument before deciding whether to trust it, and said nothing, which from her he was beginning to understand was closer to praise than most compliments. "Sandbags," she said instead, rising, wiping her hands on her already ruined apron. "You're not finished?" "No," he agreed, getting to his feet. "I don't imagine I am." They worked the line together after that, not because anyone assigned it that way, but because it became, without either of them remarking on it, simply how the night went. Philippa called instructions the way her father called for instruments. Short, exact, no room in them for anyone's feelings. Higher, tighter. No, not there, the gaps below the sill. She noticed, in the part of her mind not occupied with the river, that the Duke did not argue with a single order. He did not explain that he knew better. He did not once mention who he was, not even when Mrs. Winch's husband, arriving late and full of self-importance, tried to organize the line himself and got contradicted by a man he did not yet know, outranked him considerably. "I really think," Winch had started, "that the sacks ought to go." "Miss Tallow's already said where they go," Callum said mildly and went on tying. Winch, unused to being overruled by strangers, opened his mouth to object, caught something in the stranger's bearing that made him reconsider, and closed it again. He did not try a second time. Near 1 in the morning the line broke for water, and mud came through under the dispensary door in a thin brown sheet. Philippa swore, a proper word, one her father would have scolded her for, and went down on her knees in it, packing rags into the gap with her bare hands. Callum knelt beside her without being asked, and did the same. "You'll ruin your hands," she said, not looking at him. "I understand they mend." She glanced sideways. Mud to the wrist, cravat long gone, hair plastered flat. Nothing left of whatever he'd looked like 6 hours ago in that ruined coat. He did not seem to mind the loss. Most men in your position would be shouting for someone to fetch a physician for themselves, not on their knees, fetching mud for someone else's. "Most men in my position," he said, "have never been shown what there was to be useful for." She had no answer to that, so she gave him another rag instead. They held the door until nearly dawn, when the rain thinned to something merely miserable rather than biblical, and the water settled at the top step and went no higher. Philippa sat back on her heels, hands raw, and allowed herself one long breath. "Will it hold?" Callum asked. "For tonight." She looked at the door, hers, her father's, older than either of them, 4 inches too shallow for a river that meant business. It shouldn't have come to this in the first place. That sill wants raising properly, not propping every time it rains hard. Then raise it properly. With what? Wishes. With whatever it takes. I have nowhere else to be. He said it lightly, but something under it was not light at all, and she noticed that too, and set it aside, because it was 4 in the morning, and she had patience to see once the sun was up. She rose, offered him a hand without thinking about it, and pulled him to his feet. His grip was steady. Hers came away muddy. "Miss Tallow," Sims called from somewhere drier, scandalized to the last. "His Grace's carriage." "Isn't going anywhere for a week," Philippa said, "and neither is he. There's a room over the smithy if he doesn't mind horses. He'll want to be up by 6. There's more to do than sandbags." "Her room over the smithy," Sims repeated in the tone of a man being told his master was to be lodged in a stable, which was not far from accurate. "That's dry," Philippa said, "and it's close and it doesn't flood. If His Grace wants a feather bed and a view of the park, he's welcome to swim for London." "I'll take the smithy," Callum said before Sims could object further. "Gladly." Callum wiped his hand on his ruined shirt and offered it to her again, formally this time, as though they were being introduced at a ball rather than kneeling in 6 inches of river. "Callum," he said, "since we're to be working together, you may as well use it." She shook it once, briskly, the way she shook a nervous patient's hand before setting a bone. "Philippa Tallow. And I don't stand on ceremony at 6 in the morning, Your Grace, so don't expect me to start." "I wasn't asking you to." Something in his voice made her look at him a moment longer than the exchange required. Then her gaze dropped, unbidden, professional habit more than anything, to the ring on her own hand, plain gold, catching what little light there was. He saw where she looked. He said nothing. She turned back toward the dispensary, already thinking of the next 4 hours, the patients who would come at first light needing dry bandages and boiled water, and did not see that he was still watching the door they had spent the night defending, and the 4 inches by which it had nearly failed them both. On the second day, Sims dispatched a letter to Aldermoor by the one road still passable, a detailed account in Sims's cramped and anxious hand of the situation as it stood. His Grace stranded, the carriage fast in the ford, the household staff at the estate informed and managing affairs in his absence. Callum added a postscript to his steward Haverstock, 3 lines of instruction that covered the most pressing estate business, and gave it to Sims to send with the rider. "Haverstock will manage," he told Sims, who had the expression of a man watching civilization recede from a sinking ship. "He's managed before. He has never managed without so much as knowing when your Grace intends to return. Tell him a week, perhaps 2. Sims closed his eyes briefly, as a man does when shown an injury he has been dreading. 2 weeks, Your Grace." "The road is flooded, Sims. There is nothing to be done about it." "No, Your Grace." Sims took the letter and went, and if his posture communicated volumes about the indignity of the situation, he at least communicated them silently, which was, Callum had decided, the best one could ask of anyone under present circumstances. By the 3rd day, Pellenby had stopped asking whether the Duke minded the work and started simply handing it to him. He mucked out the Widow Cray's flooded henhouse without being told twice, and came away smelling of it for the better part of a day, a fact Tom found endlessly funny and mentioned at every opportunity. He carried Mrs. Pell's grandmother down from her cottage's upper room when the ground floor went under, and did not once mention afterward that his back had never forgiven him for anything so undignified as manual labour before that week. He learned the names of 11 villagers in 2 days, which was 11 more than Sims had learned in a lifetime of service, a fact Tom pointed out to Sims with great relish. "You've been here longer than him," Tom said, "and you still call Mr. Prewitt the carpenter fellow." "That is what he is." "His name's Prewitt." Sims sniffed and went to polish boots that did not need polishing, which was, Philippa had noticed, what Sims did whenever the world asked something of him he did not know how to give. Callum, by contrast, had taken to asking Mr. Prewitt questions with the single-mindedness of a man who had discovered at 31 that he enjoyed being taught something. "You want the sill raised the whole width of the door," Prewitt was saying on the 4th morning over the ruin of the dispensary threshold. "Not just propped, else you're back here next spring doing it again." "Show me." "Show you? I have hands. You said yourself I'm not entirely hopeless with a saw anymore." "I said you were less hopeless. There's a distance yet to travel." Philippa, crossing the yard with an armful of dry linen, caught the tail end of this and did not entirely hide her smile. Callum caught her not hiding it. "Something amusing, Miss Tallow. Only that a fortnight ago you likely had men to hold your umbrella for you." "2 men. One for the umbrella, one to open doors the first man's hands were too full to manage. And now? Now I'm being taught to build a door rather than have one opened for me. I find I prefer it." She held that look a beat too long enough that Prewitt, tactful old man that he was, found something urgent to attend to at the far end of his toolbox. And then she went on with the linen, because the surgery had 4 patients waiting, and flattery, even unintended flattery, did not set anyone's arm. Gerald arrived on the 4th day after the flood, having crossed by the upper road where the water had not yet claimed the ground, and Philippa felt the particular sinking of a woman whose 2 worlds are about to be introduced without her consent. "I came the moment I heard," he said, taking both her hands before she could offer only one. "You might have been swept away. You might have been anything." His gaze went, briefly, to the mud on her skirts, the ink and carbolic smell of the dispensary that never quite left her. "You look done in. You oughtn't be out here at all. Surely your father can manage the worst of it without you fetching and carrying like a maid." "Fetching and carrying is most of what a flood requires, Gerald." "Then let the village boys do the fetching. It isn't fitting." He said it kindly. That was, she was coming to notice, rather the trouble with Gerald. He never once raised his voice, never once said an unkind thing outright, and yet somehow every conversation ended with her doing slightly less of what she wanted and considerably more of what he thought suitable. Callum came around the corner of the smithy at that moment, sleeves rolled, a coil of rope over one shoulder, and stopped when he saw them. "Aldermoor," Gerald said, with the easy warmth of a man greeting an equal, which he was not, and knew he was not, and covered the gap with charm the way he covered everything. "We heard you were stranded among us. Bad luck, that. Though I see Miss Tallow's put you to good use. She does love a project." "She's put the whole village to good use," Callum said. "I merely arrived at a convenient moment to be included in it." "Modest of you." Gerald's smile didn't move. "Philippa, my dear, I've brought the trap round the long way. You needn't stand in this mess a moment longer." Philippa looked at the dispensary door, half repaired, and the line of patients still waiting under its eaves, and did not move. "I've work yet, Gerald. You go on ahead. I'll send word when the road's clear enough to visit properly." Something flickered across his face. Not anger, nothing so honest as anger. Only a small recalibration, the look of a man mentally rewriting a plan that had not gone quite as drafted. Then it was gone, folded back under charm. Of course, I only worry. He kissed her hand, held Callum's eye a half-second longer than courtesy required, and left the way he'd come. Callum said nothing until the trap was well down the lane. "You're intended," he said at last, not a question. "Yes." "I hadn't realized." There was no particular occasion to mention it. "We've been rather occupied with sandbags." "No," he agreed. "There wasn't." He shifted the coil of rope on his shoulder, and something in his face had gone carefully, deliberately even. A man tidying a room before company arrives, so no one will see what had been left out. "Prewitt wants me back at the sill before the light goes. I'll leave you to your patients, Miss Tallow." He did not linger. He did not say anything more than that. But he worked at the threshold until well past dark that evening, by lantern, long after Prewitt had gone home to his supper, and when Philippa passed the dispensary at 10 o'clock, she found him still there, planing a board smooth that did not, by her eye, need planing again. "You'll ruin your eyes working by that light." "I find I don't mind the dark so much, if there's something to do in it." She stood in the doorway a moment, arms crossed against the chill, watching the shavings curl off the wood in even, unhurried strokes. A man who had learned, in a week, to do one thing well and slowly, when a week ago he had likely never done anything slowly in his life. Callum. He looked up. It was the first time she'd used it without the title attached, and they both seemed to notice. "Thank you, for the door. It isn't finished." "No," she said, "not yet." She did not go in immediately. She sat instead on an overturned crate a few feet from where he worked, tired enough to let the silence sit rather than fill it. "Tell me something," she said eventually. "What did you do before this? A week ago, I mean. What did a Duke's Day look like?" He set down the plane and considered the question with more care than she'd expected. Ledgers, mostly. Tenants' rents, drainage disputes, a great deal of correspondence I did not write myself, but was obliged to sign. Dinners where I was seated according to precedence, and expected to say very little of substance. My mother writes twice a week to remind me I have not yet married, in case a week has passed in which I might have forgotten. That sounds lonely. I hadn't thought to call it that. It seemed simply the shape of the thing. He picked the plane back up, turned it over in his hands rather than using it. "I have 5,000 acres and 40 tenant families, and I could not, until this week, have told you how to fix a wall on any one of them. I signed the accounts that paid for it. I never once held the tool. And now you've held the tool." "Now I've held the tool, ruined 3 shirts, lost an argument to a stone wall and slept over a smithy for a week, and I find I have not once in all that time wished myself back among the ledgers." She looked at him a long moment. "That's either a very great compliment to Pellenby or a very poor one to Aldermoor." "Perhaps," he said. "It's neither. Perhaps it's simply the first time in some years I've been given something to do rather than something to preside over." He glanced at her. "And your father says you keep the whole of his books, besides assisting half the parish. What does your day look like when it isn't flooding?" "Ledgers, mostly," she said, and startled a laugh out of both of them. "Accounts, ordering medicines, sitting with the dying when there's nothing left to be done but sit. It isn't glamorous work." "No," he agreed, "but it's yours, every part of it. I don't think I've ever been able to say that about anything I do." "Callum," she said it again, and again it changed something in him to hear it. "Go to bed. You've a wall to finish tomorrow, and I'll not have Prewitt telling me you fell asleep standing up like a horse." "Yes, Miss Tallow." He set down the plane properly this time and did not argue. She went back inside, telling herself it was for the best. He was set to mending the churchyard wall the following week, when the sill work stalled for want of proper board, and it went considerably worse than the door had. "You're meant to lay the stone flat," Prewitt said, "watching a section of wall lean at an angle no wall ought to lean at, not stand it on its end like a tombstone. It was flat when I began. It stopped being flat somewhere in the middle of your explanation of why it needn't be." Philippa, come to fetch him for the noon meal, arrived in time to see the whole section give way with a soft, embarrassed collapse, scattering stone across the grass. "I did warn him," Prewitt said entirely without sympathy. "I heard the warning," Callum said, surveying the wreckage. "I simply believed myself equal to the wall." "You were not equal to the wall." "No," he admitted, "I was not." Philippa laughed. Properly laughed, not the polite social version, and it was, Callum thought, watching her, rather worth losing an argument with a wall to hear. "Rebuild it," she said. "Properly this time. I've patience to see, but I'll come back and inspect your work at 4. "Is that a threat?" "It's a promise, Your Grace. I don't make idle ones." Sunday brought church, and church brought the whole of Pellenby packed into pews that had not seen such attendance since the last outbreak of scarlet fever, all of them ostensibly there for the sermon, and rather more interested in seeing the Duke sit through one. He sat between Philippa's father and Tom, sang the hymns half a beat behind everyone else, and bore the vicar's pointed sermon on humility, clearly composed for the occasion, with the good grace of a man who suspected it was aimed at him and found he did not much mind. Afterward, on the green, the village conducted its usual after-service business of gossip, disguised as conversation. "They say he's stayed a full week already," Mrs. Winch informed anyone in earshot. "The upper road's been passable since Thursday, my husband says, and yet here he is, mending walls." "Perhaps he likes mending walls," said Nell Corbett, Philippa's oldest friend, arriving at Philippa's elbow with the particular directness of a woman who had known her since both were in short skirts. "Some men do, I understand, once shown how." "Perhaps he likes something," Mrs. Winch said, with a significant look toward where Philippa stood, and moved off before she could be asked to clarify. "She's not wrong to wonder," Nell said once they were alone. "Even I wonder, and I've known you since we were 7. "He's stranded, Nell. The carriage wheel was properly stuck." "The carriage wheel was sorted by Thursday. Prewitt told my brother himself. Prewitt says the axle wants a part that must come from Norwich." "Does it?" "That's what Prewitt says." Nell looked at her for a long moment. The way old friends look at each other when they have decided not to press a point they both know is there to be pressed. "Well, he's very good with children, I'll say that. Tom hasn't stopped talking about knots in a week. He's good with most things once shown." Said Nell in a tone that told Philippa exactly how much she believed the conversation was really about walls and knots, and let the subject drop for the moment. Tom found new and increasingly elaborate reasons over the following days to require Callum's assistance with knots, mending a fishing line, tying off the gate to the Fenwick paddock, once, memorably, attempting to rig a swing from the dispensary's one remaining sound tree, an enterprise Philippa put a stop to, only after the branch had already begun to protest. "Over under, pull," Tom said each time, as though Callum might have forgotten since the last lesson 20 minutes prior. "I have it, Tom. You said that yesterday, and then you tied the wrong sort entirely. That was a different knot for a different purpose. It was the wrong knot." "It held, didn't it?" "It held because I fixed it." Philippa, watching this exchange from the dispensary steps with a mug of tea going cold in her hands, thought that she had not, in 8 months of engagement to Gerald Oakes, once seen him crouch in the mud to be corrected by an 11-year-old, nor look as though he minded it in the slightest. The water began its slow retreat on the 8th day, which ought to have felt like relief, and instead felt to Philippa like a clock she had not asked to hear striking. She found Gerald in the front parlour, when she came in from her rounds, seated in her father's good chair, as though it had always been his to sit in, a cup of tea going cold at his elbow. He had been staying at the Crown since his arrival on the 4th day. The flooding made daily travel from his own home impossible, and the Crown's landlord, delighted by the custom, had not pressed for any particular departure date. "I've spoken to your father about the date," Gerald said without preamble. "October, I think, once the harvest's in. There's no sense waiting longer, and frankly, my dear, the sooner the better, given—" He gestured vaguely at her boots, still crusted with the yard. "Given what?" "Given that a man in my position oughtn't have his intended traipsing through flood water at all hours, playing nurse to the whole parish. It reflects on both of us." He said it gently, reasonably, the way he said everything. "Once we're married, of course, your father will manage well enough without you underfoot at the surgery. It isn't as though you're needed there. I've kept his books for 6 years. I've assisted with more cases than I can count. And you'll have a household of your own to keep instead, a far better use of your talents." He smiled, reached for her hand as though the matter were settled by the reaching. "You'll thank me for it, in time. A woman elbow-deep in bandages isn't quite the picture I'd hoped to make of my wife." "What picture had you hoped to make precisely?" "One that sits rather more easily at dinner parties, my dear, and rather less easily in a sick room." He said it lightly, as a joke, and watched to see whether she'd take it as one. "You'll have a still room to manage, callers to receive, a household to run properly. That's occupation enough for any sensible woman. This—" He gestured again, more broadly this time, at the dispensary beyond the window. "This is your father's work. It was never meant to be yours past girlhood. It's been mine for 6 years. And you've done him great credit with it. But credit's a different thing from duty, Philippa, And once we're married, your duty will lie with me and with our household, not with every cut finger and lying in the parish." He softened, reached for her hand once more, and this time she let him take it, mostly from tiredness. "I only want what's best suited to you. You'll see, once it's arranged. You always come round in the end." "I always come round." She turned the phrase over privately and did not like the shape of it, the quiet assumption folded inside it that whatever she wanted first was a stage to be passed through on the way to what he wanted. "It's the picture I've made of myself, Gerald, for rather longer than I've known you." "Then perhaps," he said, still smiling, still perfectly reasonable, "it's a picture that wants updating." He left soon after, satisfied as far as she could tell that the conversation had gone precisely as he'd intended it to. She sat a long while in the chair he'd vacated, turning her ring on her finger, and found that for the first time she could remember, she was doing arithmetic about her own marriage, subtracting one by one the things she would be asked to give up, and finding the sum came to rather more than she'd let herself notice before. She said none of this to Nell that evening, and Nell, calling with a basket of mending neither of them had any real intention of doing, did not press for it, only sat with her at the kitchen table and let the silence be companionable rather than expectant, which was, Philippa thought, one of the great underrated gifts a friend could give. "You've gone quiet," Nell said eventually, threading a needle she did not use. "I'm tired." "You're always tired. This is a different quiet." Philippa did not answer immediately. "Gerald thinks I ought to give up the surgery once we're married." "Does he?" Nell's voice was carefully even. "And what do you think?" "I think I haven't been asked what I think in rather a long time. Only told gently what I'll come to think eventually." "That's not nothing, Pip." "No," Philippa agreed. "I'm beginning to see that it isn't." Nell set down the needle entirely. "You know I'll say nothing against him you don't say first, but I've watched you these 8 months go quieter every time he's in the room, and louder, more yourself, every time he isn't. I didn't like to mention it. It felt like the sort of thing a person has to notice on her own account, or not notice at all." "I'm noticing it," Philippa said very quietly. "I don't know what to do with the noticing yet." Nell reached across the table and took her hand, not the practiced clasp Gerald favoured, but something plainer, steadier. "Then don't do anything with it tonight. Just let yourself have noticed. That's enough for one evening." The harvest supper, held that same week in the church hall despite the lingering mud on every road into the village, brought the whole of Pellenby together under one roof for the first time since the flood, and gave Gerald his best audience yet. He arrived polished and charming as ever, moved through the room greeting tenant farmers by name, complimenting Mrs. Winch's preserves with exactly the right measure of warmth, and found Philippa near the cider barrels, deep in conversation with Callum about the proper depth for a drainage ditch. "There you are," Gerald said, sliding an arm about her waist in a manner that was perfectly correct and yet somehow proprietary all at once. "I've been telling the Priors about the wedding. October's settled, I think. Michaelmas seemed fussy, and Christmas too far off." "We hadn't quite settled it, Gerald." "Hadn't we? I was certain we had." He smiled at Callum, easy and untroubled. "Forgive me, Aldermoor, wedding talk. Terribly dull for a bachelor, I should think." "Not at all," Callum said. "I find myself rather interested in how these things get settled." Something in his tone made Gerald's smile tighten very slightly, though his voice stayed perfectly pleasant. "It's simple enough once you're used to how it's done. One decides, and the lady comes round to agreeing." He squeezed Philippa's waist, lightly, fondly, the gesture of a man entirely confident of his ground. "Isn't that so, my dear?" Philippa did not answer at once. The pause was brief, barely a breath, but it was there, and Callum, watching, saw it land. "Something like that," she said finally, and reached for her cider rather than for Gerald's hand. Gerald was drawn away a moment later by the vicar, wanting his opinion on a matter of church repairs, and left the two of them by the barrels in a silence that had gone quite suddenly heavier than it had been. "I needn't say anything," Philippa said before Callum could. "I wasn't going to. You were thinking it very loudly." "I was thinking," he said carefully, "that I have never once in my life told a woman what she thought before she'd told me herself. I hadn't realized until just now that it was a low bar to clear." "It's a lower bar than you'd credit," Philippa said, and drank her cider and did not look at him again for the rest of the evening, because looking at him felt just then like it might cost her something she wasn't ready to spend. 2 days later, on the 10th day since the flood, word came that the upper ford was passable again, and the London road with it. Philippa heard it from Tom, who delivered the news with the gravity of a boy announcing a battle's end, and felt something in her chest drop that she did not examine too closely. She found Callum by his carriage that afternoon, the wheels freed at last from the mud that had held them fast, Sims fussing over the horses with the relief of a man returning to his natural habitat. "You'll be leaving then?" "Tomorrow, I expect. Or the day after." He did not look pleased about it, which she noted and did not remark on. "There's business at Aldermoor that's waited longer than it should." "Of course." She kept her voice light, the way she kept it for patients who needed steadiness more than sympathy. "You've a dukedom to run. I don't suppose sandbags feature much in the accounts." "No," he agreed, "they don't." He looked at her, that same unhurried look, and for a moment she thought he might say something else, something that wasn't about sandbags or accounts or the weather. "Philippa." "Your Grace," Sims called. "The second horse has thrown a shoe. Prewitt says it's a full day's work to reshoe before we can safely travel." Callum closed his eyes briefly, as though caught between relief and frustration in equal measure. "A full day." "At least, Your Grace." "Well," Philippa said, and something in her chest, which had been braced all afternoon, loosened by exactly the width of one horseshoe. "It seems you're not quite finished with Pellenby yet." "It seems not," Callum said, and did not sound in the least sorry about it. He did not leave the next day, nor the day after. The horse was reshod within hours, Prewitt's estimate having proved, as Prewitt's estimates generally did, rather more generous to himself than to the truth. The road stayed clear, his carriage stayed hitched ready, waiting in the yard behind the smithy like a question no one would ask aloud. "Prewitt says the sill wants one more coat before it's weather-tight," Callum told Sims, on the third morning past the road's clearing. "Prewitt has said that for 4 days running, Your Grace." "Then it must want it very badly." Sims, who had learned by now precisely when an argument was worth having, and when it was not, said nothing further, and went to see about the horse's feed instead. Philippa found Callum at the dispensary before dawn that 5th morning, sitting on the new threshold with his coat over his knees, not working, simply sitting, in a way she had not once seen him do since the flood began. "You're meant to be halfway to Aldermoor." "I know. Your man has the horses ready. He's told me twice." "I know that too." He looked up at her, and whatever careful arrangement he'd kept over his face all fortnight had gone, worn through the way cloth wears through at the elbow. "I don't know how to leave, Philippa. I've tried composing the sentence in my head 3 times, and it comes apart before it reaches my mouth." She sat down beside him on the step, because there did not seem to be anywhere else to put herself. "Then don't compose it, just say the plain thing." The plain thing. He turned his hands over, looked at the calluses that had not been there a fortnight ago, souvenirs of sandbags and saws and a door that had not existed before he'd come to build it. "I have spent my whole life being useful to no one in particular. Men bow, doors open. Nothing is ever asked of me that I might fail at, because nothing is ever truly asked of me at all." He looked at her. "You asked. From the first hour. You put a sack in my hands and told me to fill it, and I have not stopped being grateful since. And I don't know how to say that without it sounding like considerably more than gratitude, because it is considerably more than gratitude, and you are engaged to be married in October." "I'm not," Philippa said, "not any longer." He went very still. "When?" "Last night." She looked at her hand, bare now, the ring gone, a pale band of skin where it had sat for 8 months. "I ought to tell you properly, I think, rather than let you piece it together from what I'm not wearing." "Tell me." She let out a breath. "He came to the Crown for supper. He'd been staying there since the roads cleared, waiting on the matter of the date. He'd brought a paper from the printer in Norwich, the notice for the licence application, already drafted, my name and his set out in that neat black type as though the matter had never wanted my agreement in the first place, only my attendance. He set it on the table between us as though it were a gift." Her jaw tightened at the memory, and he said, "There now, isn't that handsome? We'll send it to the registry Monday next." And I looked at it, Callum, and I understood that I had never once in 8 months been asked a single question to which the answer mattered. Only told kindly what had already been decided, and given the courtesy of hearing it before the rest of the parish did. "What did you say to him?" "I said I wanted to think on it a little longer before Monday." And he laughed. Not unkindly, he never is unkind, that's rather the trouble with him, and said there was nothing left to think on. The harvest was in, the notice was drafted. What precisely did I imagine there was still to decide? She shook her head slowly. And I heard myself say, quite calmly, which surprised me more than anything, that I would decide when there was nothing left to decide, and not before, and that a man who could not tell the difference between my agreement and my silence was not a man I meant to marry in October or any other month. And then? And then I gave him back the ring, and he told me I was making a very great mistake I would regret within the year, and I told him that might well be true, but it would be my mistake to make, which was rather the point. She looked down at her bare hand again. He left in considerable temper, for a man who prides himself on never losing one. I don't think I've ever seen him so close to shouting. "Philippa, I didn't do it for you." She said it firmly, because it mattered to her that he understand it that neither of them build the next part of this on a foundation that wasn't true. I did it because he asked me to be smaller, and I found I couldn't do it, not even for a comfortable house and a settled name. I'd been doing the arithmetic for weeks. You only happened to be standing nearby when I finished it. I don't mind being nearby. No, she said, and something in her chest, wound tight for a fortnight, finally loosened. I don't suppose you would. He took her hand, the bare one, the one that had held saw and sandbag and rag alike these past weeks, and did not say anything grand about it. He simply held it, the way he'd held the door frame steady while Prewitt drove the nails, as though steadiness were the whole of what he had to offer, and he meant to offer it properly. I built you a door that will outlast us both, he said. I find I should like to build a good deal more than that if you'll let me. That is a very poor proposal, Your Grace. I've had no practice. You may correct my form as you did with the sandbags. She laughed, the first real laugh she'd allowed herself in a week, and did not pull her hand away. Ask me properly then, I'll tell you if you've got it wrong. He turned on the step to face her fully, took both her hands this time and did not look away from her once. Philippa Tallow, I came to Pellenby by accident of weather and a badly built axle, and I mean to leave it, if you'll allow me, considerably less accidentally than I arrived, as your husband, if you'll have me, or as your very devoted admirer for however long it takes you to decide I've earned better. I've very little to offer you that you don't already have in greater measure than I do. Competence, purpose, a door that doesn't leak. What I have is this. I will never once ask you to be smaller than you are, and I will spend a good deal of effort learning to be worthy of standing beside someone who isn't. He paused. Was that better form? Middling, she said, though her voice had gone unsteady. You want fewer words and more feeling. Then, I love you, plainly and rather more than is convenient, and I should like very much to marry you. That's better, she said, and did not tell him he'd got it wrong. Her father found them there a half-hour later, still on the threshold, and took in the sight of them, hands joined, her ring gone from her finger, and not yet replaced by any other. With the same unhurried, unsurprised look, he gave a diagnosis he'd suspected for weeks, before it was finally confirmed. Well, he said, I suppose I ought to ask your intentions, Your Grace, though I confess I think I already know them. Entirely honourable, Dr. Tallow. I should like your permission to marry your daughter. I have it, though I doubt either of you was waiting on it. Her father's eyes crinkled. I'll say this much. You've been a better apprentice these 3 weeks than most I've paid to train. Prewitt says the same of the carpentry. I don't know a great many dukes who'd wear well under that kind of instruction. I don't know that I'd have worn well under any other kind. No, her father agreed, looking between the two of them with something that was almost but not quite smugness. I don't suppose you would. He clapped Callum once on the shoulder, gruff and genuine. Welcome to the family, such as it is. Mind you keep raising thresholds, this one's inherited my temper, about a leaking roof. I'd noticed, Callum said, and Philippa, laughing despite herself, did not argue the point. Pellenby had opinions and did not keep them to itself. Duke, said Mrs. Winch over the counter of the general shop, to anyone who would stand still, and her not 3 weeks unengaged from Mr. Oakes. It isn't decent whatever anyone says about floods and sandbags. It isn't anyone's business but Miss Tallow's, said Nell Corbett, who happened to be next in the queue, and said it with enough steel that Mrs. Winch found something else to discuss. Not everyone was so ungenerous. The widow Cray, whose henhouse Callum had mucked out without complaint, declared to anyone who'd listen that any man willing to shovel manure for a stranger's chickens could be trusted with a doctor's daughter, and that was the end of the matter as far as she was concerned. Prewitt, asked directly by the vicar's wife whether he thought the match suitable, said only that the man could finally lay a straight course of stone, which from Prewitt was as ringing an endorsement as any bishop's blessing. Gerald took it worse and less quietly than his usual manner suggested he was capable of. He came to the surgery once more, 4 days after Callum's proposal was common knowledge, and found Philippa alone at the dispensary counting bandages. I hope you're satisfied, he said without greeting. You've made me a laughingstock, jilted for a duke who fell in your lap by accident of weather. I jilted you before I knew he meant to ask me anything, Gerald. You'll do yourself no credit rewriting the order of it. You think this will last? You think a man like that keeps a village doctor's daughter once the novelty's worn off, once he's back among his own kind? His composure had cracked at last, and beneath it was something plainer and less attractive than the charm he usually wore. You'll be an embarrassment to him within the year, some drawing-room ornament who doesn't know which fork to use, trotted out at dinner to be laughed at behind fans. Perhaps. Philippa did not stop counting bandages. But I'll be an embarrassment who was never asked to be smaller for it. I find I prefer the risk. You always did think rather too well of yourself for a country doctor's daughter. And you, she said, setting down the bandages at last and looking at him directly, always did think rather too little of me for someone who claimed to love me. I don't think either of us is wrong about the other, Gerald. I only think we finally see it plainly. He had no answer to that. He left without another word and did not call again, and the village, having exhausted its opinions on the scandal within a fortnight, as villages generally did, moved on to the more pressing matter of the harvest. A letter arrived from Aldermoor Hall a week later, in a hand Philippa did not recognize, and Callum's face, reading it, went carefully unreadable in a way she had come to associate with things he did not yet know how to say. My mother, he said finally, she's heard. And? She has expressed her opinions at considerable length and with great precision. He set the letter down. She wishes to know whether I have entirely taken leave of my senses, whether I understand what is owed to the name, and whether I intend to bring a country physician's daughter to dine with the Dowager Duchess of Aldermoor, without first warning the poor woman. A physician's daughter, Philippa said, not an apothecary's. I don't believe that distinction will trouble her overmuch. He rubbed a hand across his jaw. She'll come round. She generally does once a thing is settled rather than merely proposed. But I'd be lying if I told you the coming round will be entirely comfortable to watch. Should I be worried? No. He said it with more certainty than she expected. I've spent 31 years being agreeable to a great many people whose good opinion mattered rather less to my happiness than I let myself believe. I find I've lost the taste for it. He picked the letter back up, folded it decisively. She'll meet you, she'll disapprove for perhaps a fortnight. And then, because she is not a stupid woman, she'll notice that you keep better books than my last 3 stewards combined, and that Pellenby's tenants haven't lost a harvest to poor drainage in a decade, and her disapproval will curdle, slowly, into something she'll never admit is respect. That's a very specific prediction. I know my mother considerably better than I know myself most days. I'll wager the fortnight. He was nearly right as it turned out, though it took closer to 3 weeks and involved a good deal more correspondence than either of them found entirely comfortable. But that was a battle for after the wedding, and Philippa, for now, set it aside. Callum's solicitor rode up from London within the week, carrying the application for a special licence from the Archbishop's registry, the proper route for a man of Callum's rank, efficient and unambiguous, requiring no public readings and no waiting on the convenience of a parish calendar. Philippa's father signed where required. The licence was granted inside a fortnight, which, in the circumstances, felt almost unseemly, but which neither of them was inclined to argue with. Callum stayed through the licence, through the last of the harvest, through a second smaller flood in September that the new dispensary threshold turned away without difficulty, dry as a bone, while the old sill would have let the water straight through. 4 inches, Philippa said, standing in the doorway and watching the water sit obediently on the wrong side of it. You've saved my father's entire dispensary with 4 inches of pine. I had good instruction. I had a great deal of patience. I don't know that Prewitt's instruction alone accounts for it. No, he agreed, that part I brought myself. The night before the wedding, Nell came to sit with Philippa in her old room, the two of them surrounded by the small chaos of a dress laid out and pinned and fussed over more than either of them thought strictly necessary. Are you frightened? Nell asked, threading yet another needle she likely wouldn't use. A little, not of him. Of what, then? Of the size of it, I think. Of a world I don't know the rules for yet. Dinners with precedents, a mother-in-law with opinions, a house with more rooms than I've patience. She smoothed the dress's sleeve, unnecessarily. I've spent my whole life being useful in ways I understood. I don't yet know what use I'll be there. You'll find a use, Nell said, with the plain confidence of someone who had watched her friend find a use for herself in every circumstance life had yet handed her. You found one for a duke inside a single evening. I expect a dowager duchess will prove rather less trouble than a flood." Philippa laughed, and found, when she examined the fear more closely, that it had shrunk considerably in the telling. They married in the last week of October, in the same church where Philippa had been christened, with her father giving her away in his good coat, and Tom serving as an entirely unnecessary but very determined witness to every part of the proceedings, standing so close to the altar rail that the vicar twice had to ask him gently to step back. Nell stood beside her, in blue, crying rather more than she'd admitted she intended to. Sims, to everyone's mild astonishment, wept openly through the whole of the vows and did not attempt to hide it. The Dowager Duchess attended, seated in the front pew in unimpeachable black silk, her face arranged into an expression of careful, reserved neutrality that gave away nothing, until the moment Callum, reciting his vows, stumbled slightly over a word, and Philippa, without thinking, reached out and steadied his hand, and the old woman's mouth, watching, twitched very slightly at one corner in a way that might, on a more forthcoming face, have been called the beginning of a smile. "I, Callum, take thee, Philippa," he said, and his voice, which had commanded rooms and ledgers and tenant disputes for a decade, was not entirely steady, "to have and to hold from this day forward. For better, for worse," the vicar prompted when he paused a beat too long. "For better, for worse," Callum repeated, looking at her rather than at the vicar. "For richer, for poorer, though I confess I intend to see to it we shan't test that half over much, in sickness and in health." "You needn't promise me that part," Philippa murmured just for him. "I intend to see to the sickness myself." A ripple of laughter went through the front pews, quickly stifled, and the vicar, who had married a great many Pellenby couples, and none of them quite like this, pressed determinedly on. The wedding breakfast was held in the yard behind the surgery, because Philippa had refused, gently but absolutely, to be married from anywhere that did not still smell faintly of carbolic and rain, and Callum had not once suggested otherwise. At the outer frame of the dispensary door, the new one, pale wood just beginning to weather toward grey, someone had tied a strip of white ribbon. It was visible from the yard, and every guest who passed near it that day touched it once for luck, the way villages did with things that had proven once to hold. "You know," Prewitt said to Callum late in the afternoon, cup in hand, watching the dancing start on the green, "that door'll outlast the both of us." "I'm counting on it." Funny thing to build a marriage on, a door. Callum looked across the yard to where Philippa stood laughing at something Tom had said, sleeves rolled as they so often were, entirely unlike any Duchess Prewitt had ever heard tell of, and, in Callum's estimation, considerably better for it. "I don't think it's the door," he said. "I think it's what she taught me building it." Aldermoor Hall was, Philippa discovered within her first week as its mistress, a house built for people who had never once needed to know where anything practical was kept. "Where?" she asked Mrs. Handler, the housekeeper, on the third morning. "Do you keep bandages?" "Bandages, Your Grace?" "Linen. Clean linen and something I can use for a splint if it comes to that. There must be a still room." "There is a still room, Your Grace, though I confess it's been given over to preserves these many years. Her Grace, the Dowager that is, never had much use for it beyond jam." "Then it's about to have a great deal more use than jam." By the end of the month, the still room held bandages, willow bark, a case of instruments sent up from Pellenby at her request, and a ledger in her own hand, recording every tenant complaint from gout to broken fingers, kept with the same brisk exactness she'd once kept her father's books. The upper housemaids learned quickly that the new Duchess did not ring for things to be fetched to her. She went and fetched them herself, and expected help only when the task genuinely wanted 2 pairs of hands. "It isn't done," Mrs. Handler ventured once, watching Philippa roll bandages at the kitchen table rather than in whatever room a duchess was meant to roll bandages in, if such rooms existed. "The tenants will think their duchess knows how to set a wrist," Philippa said, not looking up. "I find I can live with that." It was not a small adjustment taking on Aldermoor. The house had 40 rooms, a staff of 26, and tenants on 5,000 acres who had grown accustomed, over generations, to a management style that consisted primarily of being left alone. Philippa spent her first month walking the estate boundaries with the steward Haverstock, a careful and meticulous man who had spent 3 years patiently waiting for someone at Aldermoor to ask him the right questions. She asked them. He answered with the barely concealed relief of a man who had been sitting on good ideas with no one to receive them. "The lower field drains badly," he said on the third walk. "Has done for 20 years. We lose a quarter of the yield to standing water in wet seasons." "Show me where." He showed her. She looked at the ground for a long time, the way she looked at a wound she was calculating how to close. It wants a cut channel along the eastern edge, down to the existing ditch. She walked the line with her heel, marking it. 20 yards, perhaps 25. My father's village has done it twice on smaller plots. It isn't complicated work. No, Your Grace. Only no one has suggested it before. No one with boots on the ground and a reason to care, she said. And Haverstock, who had worked for 4 separate ducal households, wrote it down without further comment and arranged for the work the following spring. The Dowager Duchess arrived at Aldermoor a fortnight after the wedding, precisely as threatened, and conducted her first inspection of the new Duchess with the unhurried thoroughness of a woman who had spent 40 years learning exactly how much could be said without ever raising one's voice. "For you keep your own accounts, I understand," she said, over tea poured with excruciating correctness in the good drawing-room. "I do." Callum's last 3 stewards could not be trusted with a household ledger between them. "He tells me you found an error in the Aldermoor tenant rolls within your first week that had stood uncorrected for 6 years. 2 errors. The second was smaller." The Dowager's teacup paused very briefly on its way to her mouth. "He also tells me you dressed a tenant boy's broken arm at the harvest fair last month, in full view of half the county. The boy needed his arm set. I didn't think the county's opinion of my sleeves outweighed that." "No," the Dowager said, after a silence long enough that Philippa braced herself for the worst of it. "I don't suppose it did." She set down her cup with the air of a woman filing away evidence for a verdict not yet due. "You'll dine with me tomorrow. Alone. I find I have a great many questions and I begin to suspect you'll actually answer them, which is more than I can say for most of the company I keep." It took, as Callum had predicted, rather longer than the promised fortnight. Nearer 3 weeks of pointed questions, careful silences, and one memorable evening in which the Dowager quizzed Philippa on estate drainage for the better part of an hour and appeared by the end of it, almost disappointed to find nothing to correct. By Christmas she had taken to introducing her in company not as "my son's wife," but as the Duchess, who mends things nobody else thinks to, which Callum assured Philippa was as close to unqualified praise as his mother's vocabulary permitted. The Dowager never said directly that she had been wrong to disapprove, but she began writing to Philippa separately from Callum on matters of household and estate, as though the 2 of them had come to some private understanding that required no ceremony. The letters were brisk and occasionally demanding, and Philippa answered them in the same register, and they got along in this way rather better than either of them would have admitted to Callum. She found her footing at dinners more slowly than she'd found it anywhere else, and said so once late at night to Callum, after a particularly trying evening, spent seated between a bishop who would not stop discussing his gout and a countess who addressed no remark to her directly for the entire first course. "I don't know the rules," she admitted, unpinning her hair with more force than strictly necessary. "I know how to lance a boil. I don't know which fork wants using for fish, and I'm beginning to suspect nobody in that room believed I did either." "Does it matter what they believed?" "It shouldn't. It does a little at 11 at night after 4 courses of being talked past." He came and sat behind her, took the brush from her hand, and drew it through her hair with the same unhurried care he'd once given a plane and a length of pine. "The Countess," he said, "has addressed a direct remark to no one at that table in the 20 years I've known her. It isn't you, it's simply the shape of her. That's a kind thing to say, and I don't believe a word of it. Believe this much. I've sat through 20 years of those dinners knowing precisely which fork to use, and I have never once said anything at one of them worth remembering. You corrected the bishop's arithmetic on the parish poor rate without raising your voice and left him thinking it had been his own idea. I'd rather have your evening than mine, every time." She let herself lean back against him, tired in the way that had less to do with the hour than with the effort of being watched all night by people deciding what to make of her. "It gets easier?" "It gets easier, and where it doesn't, you'll simply stop minding whether it does. I watched you decide not to mind a great many things in Pellenby that first fortnight. A countess with poor manners will not trouble you indefinitely." He was right, though it took the better part of a year rather than an evening, a year of dinners grown steadily less foreign, of tenants' wives who came first for remedies and stayed eventually for conversation, of a household that learned its mistress kept her own hours and expected everyone under her roof to be as plainly useful as she was herself. Margaret was born the following autumn, loud and furious about the whole business from her first breath, in a room from which Callum was firmly excluded by every convention of the age, and stood outside anyway, in the corridor, for 11 straight hours, refusing every offer of brandy or a chair. "You might sit, Your Grace," Sims suggested some 4 hours in. "I might." He did not. When the midwife finally opened the door to tell him he had a daughter, he was still standing exactly where he'd planted himself that morning, coat long discarded, cravat undone, looking considerably more wrecked than a man who had done nothing but wait in a corridor had any right to look. "She has your temper already," the midwife informed him, with the weary satisfaction of a woman who had just spent 11 hours confirming it. Screamed the moment she saw daylight and hasn't stopped since. He went in to find Philippa sitting up against the pillows, exhausted and radiant, holding a very small, very furious bundle, who appeared to be objecting to the general circumstances of her arrival with considerable vigour. "She's cross," Philippa said, "and I haven't the faintest idea why. She's warm, she's fed, she's got both her parents, there's nothing left to complain of." "Perhaps she takes after her mother," Callum said, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed, who once informed a duke he'd never done a great many things and would today do one more. "That," Philippa said, "was entirely justified." "I don't doubt it'll prove entirely justified in her case too." He held his daughter for the first time with the same careful, unpracticed concentration he'd once given a sandbag knot, arms too stiff, grip too cautious, until Philippa reached over and adjusted his hold with 2 brisk corrections, the way she'd once adjusted his grip on a saw. "There," she said, "you'll not drop her now." "I wasn't going to drop her." "You were thinking about it very hard, which is nearly the same danger." Margaret, as if in agreement, stopped crying the moment she was settled properly against him, blinked up with an expression of profound and entirely unwarranted suspicion, and went, after a long moment's consideration, to sleep. Edmund followed 3 years later, considerably quieter about his own arrival, though he made up for the deficit within his first 12 months by developing an early and consuming passion for anything that could be dismantled. By the age of 2, no clock in Aldermoor Hall could be trusted to keep accurate time, and several door hinges required Prewitt's cousin, sent up from Pellenby at Callum's request, to set right twice a year. "He's got your hands," Philippa told Callum, watching their son solemnly attempt to remove a wheel from his own toy cart with a spoon, "and my father's utter disregard for whether a thing was working perfectly well before he got hold of it. A dangerous combination. Extremely. I give it 5 years before he's dismantled something load-bearing." It was closer to 7. A garden gate, not load-bearing, though it took the better part of an afternoon and Callum's genuine admiration to determine that the boy had correctly identified the fault in the hinge before attempting a repair considerably beyond his engineering, if not his enthusiasm. "He'll want proper instruction," Callum said that evening, "before he takes down a wall the way I once did." "You still argue with walls occasionally." "I concede far more gracefully now. You've had 11 years to improve my form." The children grew, and Aldermoor grew with them. Not in size, but in the way a house grows when people inside it begin to leave marks that matter. The still room Philippa had claimed in her first week expanded, quietly over the years, until half the hall's east wing housed what amounted, in practice, to a small infirmary for the estate workers and their families, staffed by Philippa when they were at Aldermoor and by a trained apothecary. She had found and engaged herself the rest of the time. The Dowager disapproved of this arrangement for approximately a fortnight, then appeared unannounced one Tuesday morning to inspect the ledger, found it impeccable, and said nothing more about it. Margaret, by 7, had appointed herself assistant to the apothecary, in all matters not requiring actual chemical knowledge, which left her primary role as following the poor man from room to room, asking questions he did not always know how to answer. Callum observed this once from the doorway, and recognized in his daughter's expression the same quality he had seen in Philippa on the night of the flood, the absolute, unsentimental conviction that there was a right answer to every problem, and that the problem existed primarily so she could find it. "She'll be formidable," he told Philippa that evening. "She already is," Philippa said. "She's 7. I mean, she'll be formidable in a way the world will have opinions about." Philippa looked at him. "Then the world will have to manage. She has the hands for it and the mind for it, and if the world ever develops the sense to let her use them properly, it will be much the better for it." She set down her book. "We'll see to it she has every means we can give her. What she does with them is hers." He had no argument with that and did not attempt one. Pellenby remained, through all of it, the place they returned to, Christmases at the surgery with her father, who grew slower each year but no less exacting about his ledgers. Summers when Margaret and Edmund ran half-wild through streets that still, in low light, showed the faint high-water marks of a flood neither child had been alive to see. Dr. Tallow taught his grandchildren to set splints on old broom handles the way he'd once taught Philippa, and declared Margaret better with a needle and thread than most grown men he had trained. The last summer before Dr. Tallow slowed enough to need his daughter, rather than merely want her nearby, Philippa found him in the dispensary at dusk, going over accounts he had looked at 3 times already that week. "Leave those," she said. "Come and sit with us." He looked up, and she saw in his face the particular softness of a man who understood that the best thing he had done with his life was teach his daughter to be useful to it. "You're well, Philippa?" "Very well." "He's good to you, not just kind, good?" "Yes, Papa, genuinely." He nodded once and closed the ledger. "Then I haven't much to complain of." He looked past her, through the window, to where Callum was visible in the yard, showing Edmund the correct way to stack, of all things, a sandbag. "He's teaching the boy again." "He teaches him every year. Edmund unlearns it every year, so he has an excuse to be taught again." Her father laughed, low and satisfied. "Sounds about right." He rose slowly and let her take his arm as they went toward the yard. "That door's held 3 floods since he built it, you know." "I know." "Good work, that. Whoever showed him." "I believe," Philippa said, "it was a mutual effort. 11 years on from the flood that had first brought them together, the river rose again. Nothing like that first autumn, only a hard week of rain and a swollen ford, the kind Pellenby had long since learned to shrug at, and the dispensary door held the water back, without so much as a damp step. Philippa, Duchess of Aldermoor these 11 years, and still 3 days a week whenever they were in Pellenby, her father's most reliable pair of hands at the surgery, stood in the doorway watching her daughter attempt to teach her younger brother the correct way to tie off a sandbag, over-under-pull, with the exact patience of a girl who had heard the story of that knot 100 times and never tired of telling it. "You're doing it wrong on purpose," said Margaret, age 9, to her brother. "I'm not. Nobody's this bad by accident. Papa says so." "Papa was terrible at it the first time too," Philippa called from the doorway. "Ask your grandfather. He'll tell you the whole story and probably improve on it." "He already has," Margaret said darkly. 3 times. It gets longer every year." Behind them, Callum came up the path from the stable yard, mud to the ankle in a manner that would have scandalized every valet in London, and did not trouble Sims, older now, greyer, and considerably less prone to wringing his hands, having spent 11 years discovering that the world did not, in fact, end simply because his employer occasionally arrived home covered in mud, in the slightest. "Your son," Callum said to Philippa by way of greeting, "has decided sandbags are beneath the future Duke." "Has he?" "I've explained that they were not beneath the last one." "And?" "He remains unconvinced. I believe I shall have to demonstrate again." "You always say that," said young Edmund, 6 years old and possessed of his mother's flat refusal to be impressed by rank. "And then you still tie it wrong." "I tie it wrong on purpose," Callum said with great dignity, "to give your sister something to correct." "That's what you said last time too." "It was true last time too." Philippa smiled and did not move from the doorway, watching him cross the yard toward the children. This man who 11 years ago had not known how to fill a sack or tie a knot, who had learned both badly on his knees in the mud because a village doctor's daughter had put a task in his hands and expected him to see it through. He crouched now beside his son with the ease of long practice, and began patiently over-under-pull to teach him properly. When he'd got Edmund's knot to hold at last, he came to stand beside her at the door, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen considerably better decades. "Your mother writes," Philippa said, "that she still can't quite credit it. 11 years, and she says you look happier mending a fence than she ever saw you at any dinner table. My mother took rather longer than I promised you she would, but she got there. Her last letter said Margaret has your temper, and Edmund has my talent for ruining good wood, and between the 2 of them she despairs of a decorous grandchild. She adores them. Shamelessly. She's promised Margaret her own library on the condition she stops correcting the dowager's grammar in company. Margaret won't take that condition." "No," Callum agreed with evident pride. "I don't imagine she will." They stood together a moment, watching the water sit at the base of the threshold obedient, going exactly where it was told. "Do you remember," Philippa said, "the first sandbag?" "I remember I couldn't tie the knot." "You remember you argued with the wall and lost." "That too." He looked at her, and whatever careful arrangement he'd once worn over his face, the one she'd first seen crack apart on this same threshold, 11 years and 2 children and a whole rebuilt life ago, had long since given way to something entirely unguarded. I remember thinking that first night that I had never in my life been handed something and simply trusted to see it through, and that it terrified me rather more than the flood did. And now? Now I've been handed rather a great deal more than a sandbag, and I find the terror has worn off entirely, or transformed into something else. I don't know what to call it. I'd call it a marriage, Philippa said, if you're asking. I believe I am. She touched the doorframe as she went in, an old habit worn smooth by 11 years of passing hands, hers and her father's, and now her children's, and thought, not for the first time, that some things built well enough did not need to be built again. They only needed tending. Behind her, in the yard, she heard her son manage the knot at last, and her husband's low, unhurried laugh of approval, and beneath it, very faint, the particular sound of water going exactly where it was told.